Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Anshel Pfeffer has maintained from the outset of this appalling war that Israel would not be able to achieve its war aim of defeating Hamas, let alone releasing all of the hostages at the same time. With the war now in its fourth month and over 28,000 dead, what is likely to be its outcome? For those that don't know Anshel, he is the Economist Israel correspondent, an opinion writer and correspondent with the Israeli daily Haaretz. He's also written an unofficial biography of Benjamin Netanyahu called Bibi. Hello and welcome, Anshel.
Hi, good evening.
Thanks for joining us. Can you just give us an update? At the moment, there are news of some kind of deal being passed from international negotiations to the Qataris, and then I think Hamas has been considering it. What do you know?
Well, we're at the stage where drafts are being passed between Hamas and Israel. There are two main channels of negotiation. One is through the Egyptians, who have a certain approach. We can kind of go into the differences between the Egyptians and the other main broker, the Qataris, who are basically Hamas's patrons in many ways. And as you would expect in this type of negotiation, where the sides aren't sitting in the same room, aren't talking directly, obviously have a visceral hatred of each other, but still have some interest in trying to get to a deal. We're not going to see breakthroughs, I think, overnight. And I think that realistically, this could take at least a couple more weeks until perhaps, and there's certainly no guarantee that there's going to be an agreement. There's a broad understanding that the main components of this will be release of more tranches of the Israeli hostages who have been held captive now for 4 months by Hamas in Gaza. Israel's official number is 136, of whom 32 at least are presumed dead, and probably more than that are, if not dead, in a very, very dangerous situation. And on the other hand, Israel will agree to some type of ratio of Palestinian prisoners being released. In the previous deal, which was by now a couple of months ago, it was 3 Palestinian prisoners for each Israeli hostage. It'll probably be a different ratio this time. And the other main component of the deal is some form of a ceasefire. And that may prove to be the main sticking point of what will be the duration of the ceasefire, how comprehensive will it be? Does it mean Israel taking its forces entirely out of the Gaza Strip? Or does it mean that they'll be in various positions that they are now, but there won't actually be kinetic warfare? All these things will be or are being discussed now, are being sent back and forth in the various drafts that Israel and Hamas are preparing and sending through the mediators. The mediators themselves are probably making suggestions. There's also a major involvement of the United States, the Biden administration. The head of CAA has been a few times already in the region. He's involved in this as well. So, and obviously Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, is arriving in the next few hours in Israel, and this is very much part of what his visit is about.
Okay, we'll come back in a bit to the possible outcomes of those negotiations, and particularly with the hostages as well. But can we just go back to October, November? What did you discern as the IDF's objectives then, both in terms of their war aims and also in terms of their strategy? How did they go about doing that?
Well, it's really important here to differentiate between the IDF and the Israeli government, and even between different parts of the Israeli government. The Israeli government, or Netanyahu and some of the ministers, were making and have been making very sweeping claims about a total victory and destroying Hamas, and obviously at some point also releasing the hostages. I think the IDF, for the most, has been more realistic. First of all, they haven't used, at least the senior generals, the ones who have been talking in public, haven't used that kind of sweeping language. They've spoken of dismantling Hamas's military capabilities, and they haven't, they haven't really set a time frame. They've certainly been careful not to say that it can be done in a matter of 2 or 3 months, going back really to the early stages of the war in mid-October. I was already hearing most of the senior generals then saying that the realistic time frame could be up to a year. So, it's kind of difficult to, you can take one statement here or there by any Israeli figure and say, well, this is now a failure, this hasn't happened. But I think most of the serious military people were saying 3-4 months ago that don't expect 3 or 4 months to be enough. And they weren't saying we will destroy Hamas from the earth and there will be no remnant of this organization called Hamas. I think they were quite clear at the time that Hamas, certainly in off-record conversations that I was having with them, Hamas is a Islamic militant ideology. It's not something, ideologies and beliefs aren't something that you can wipe out. And Hamas isn't just in Gaza. It's got, Gaza is obviously where it was born and it's its main stronghold, but it has other strongholds in the West Bank and other parts of the Arab world and even further afield. So the idea of total destruction of Hamas was never on the cards, except perhaps in some bombastic statements by some Israeli politicians. If you take the more realistic, more pragmatic approach that they were talking about 3 or 4 months ago, I'd say that they haven't quite reached, I think, what they expected to reach in this time period. I think some things have surprised the IDF, or to some degree, the extent of the tunnels. They knew that they were going to be up against an organization which had hundreds of kilometers of tunnels under Gaza, in which to hide, from which to launch attacks, from which to shelter, and so on, and which were also being used to hide hostages. They didn't. They admit it now. They didn't fully realize the extent of the tunnels. I mean, they're talking now about something which could be as much as 700 kilometers, even more. It's more than twice the London Underground or comparable mass underground transport systems in other major cities of the world. This is really something that I've been embedded a few times with the IDF over the last few months in some of these tunnels, and they are quite staggering. The level of construction that's gone in. Some of them are quite big, some of them are very deep. There's various equipment there, and it's it's nothing. It doesn't correspond with any idea or notion that we have of the situation in Gaza. We're talking also about something which would have also cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build over the 16 years that Hamas has been in control. So that's the one thing I think that has taken, to a degree, taken the IDF by surprise. The other thing is the way that the tunnels have been used. The assumption was that the tunnels would be mainly used to launch attacks, and to wherever the IDF were maneuvering in, there would suddenly be a couple of Hamas fighters suddenly appearing from underground with a rocket-propelled grenade and trying to launch ambushes. Now, those have happened, but nowhere near to the extent that the IDF expected. So what has transpired, that the strategy of Hamas has been basically from the moment that the IDF went in on the ground, 20 days after October 7th, so at the end of October, basically from the moment that the ground maneuver began, has been mainly a strategy of preservation. Hamas understands that it can't face Israel, except it can launch a surprise attack, which it did with devastating success on October 7th. But suddenly when the IDF amasses its armored brigades and divisions, they don't really have any kind of chance of fighting in that, out in the open. There's no, and even launching ambushes as they did, that's sort of a guerrilla tactic, but it's not a main strategy. The main strategy of Hamas now is to try and preserve as much as it can of its force for the, and I think that's one of the another surprise. And I think also there was, I mean, this is a kind of warfare that no army in the world has ever done. No army in the world has ever gone into a city, and Gaza city, certainly not one of the grandest cities in the world, but it was a city which until 4 months ago, over 1 million people lived in. So it's not a small place. Go into a large urban area which has hundreds of kilometers of tunnels under it being used for military purposes. And these tunnels aren't just coming out in the open. They're under schools, they're under mosques, they're under hospitals, they're under private homes. It's not a military scenario that any army in the world has fought. And one of the things that the IDF has realized, that even if you're in control of everything over the ground, and they're certainly not in control of everything, it's a war zone, even if you had total control, just to try and start dismantling or blowing up or destroying, however you're going to go about it, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels is a massive engineering project, which is something.
Anshel, it sounds like to me that you're providing a sort of justification for the IDF's operations overall, which makes sense to me. But I'm trying to, on the one hand, they're saying, it seems to me that the IDF leadership is saying that they understand that Hamas is an ideology and they're more pragmatic in their approach, and they don't have they're not going to pretend that they can get rid of Hamas straight away. It's not that simple. Yet at the same time, they're going about destruction on a massive scale. You mentioned mosques, there's universities, courts, any aspect of government, entire neighborhoods, entire streets demolished. And you've written about this yourself. And I'm trying to weigh up those two together. I mean, are you? What's the rationale? Are you saying that that's an effective policy for getting rid of Hamas?
No, there are other aspects as well. There's the aspect of what we've kind of lost sight of. There were two war objectives. I'm not including here the hostages. One was to dismantle or destroy Hamas's military capabilities. The other one was to end its rule of Gaza. Now, the argument over what constitutes a legitimate military target, that's a really good a question that needs to be asked here. And I'm not a legal expert. Obviously, I have written a bit about this because it's important. The facts on the ground are that the IDF has destroyed any building that they see as being somehow involved with Hamas, whether it's offices or any type of governmental involvement, or it's a building that they thought suspected or found any kind of military involvement with. And the argument over whether all of those targets were justified under IHL is certainly something which is going to continue to rage for I don't know for how long, but it won't end with the end of this war. The result at the end is that 50% of the buildings in Gaza City have been damaged seriously, uninhabitable. Now, this is something that the IDF went in open-eyed, and it has something. And you could say that it was part of the war aims. Yes, one of the war aims was to create such a level of damage in Gaza, which some would call it restore Israeli deterrent, others would call it make a point of how Hamas had failed to, whatever it had succeeded on October 7th, it had brought upon Gaza this level of destruction. And the third point is that Hamas has used Gaza, and this is, whether or not this justifies the level of destruction, Hamas has basically honeycombed Gaza, not just its tunnels, but so many of the buildings. And, those things I've seen from the embeds, you do see countless residential buildings which were used with lookout posts and for weapon storage, and for hiding rocket launchers. There were thousands of buildings had rocket launchers which have been used to fire on Israel. Does that justify? I think some of those targets are justified. Others are much more.
But what you've highlighted also is a doctrine of disproportionate response that comes out of, this was seen in 2006 in Dahia in South Lebanon, and I think it's actually been written about the Israeli Center for Strategic Studies, it's ICASS, as a doctrine of disproportionate response. In other words, part of the war, as you've just suggested there, was to basically say, if this is the cost of what Hamas has done, if you want to consider this again, this will be the result.
I'm not sure this is exactly the Dahia doctrine, in the sense that the Dahia doctrine was, as you said, something which was made as a warning that if Hezbollah, in that case, would attack Israel again in the way it did in 2006, there would be widespread devastation of areas which were strongholds of Hezbollah, in this case, the Dahia neighborhood in Beirut. I don't think even Hezbollah has used Dahia in the same way that Hamas has used Gaza. Now, once again, the question of exactly which buildings were targeted and were they legitimate targets is a legal argument. But in this case, most of the targets I've been looking at were somehow linked to Hamas military activities. And this is something which has happened in Gaza in 16 years. Hamas has turned Gaza into a city which is still, it's taken a civilian city and made it into a military stronghold. So, like I said, going through every single building and working out the justification. I'm sure there were many buildings which should...
Anshel, the death toll is staggering, isn't it? We're not talking about thousands now. We're now talking about tens of thousands. I mean, that alone must give Israelis pause for thought.
Well, once again, there's 27,000 dead. Israel believes that nearly half of those are Hamas fighters, so around 60%.
When you say Israel, what do you mean? You mean the IDF, do you mean the government? Do you mean the whole of Israeli society? What do you mean?
Sorry? No,
you said Israel.
Israeli intelligence assesses that of the 27,000, 10 or 11,000 at least are Hamas fighters. So we're talking about 15, 16,000 civilians. That is a very high death toll. But once again, this is the death toll that could have been expected in a war being carried out in a city where living people are being used by Hamas's shields. I think it's a terrible death toll, but I don't think that it's surprising in that number. If Israel were not to go in and just like take what happened on October 7 lying down, then it wouldn't have happened. But if Israel had a case to go and attack Hamas in Gaza, that is not a number that I would have been surprised by.
What kind of coverage is there of the bombing within Gaza in Israel, in the media? Do Israelis see?
It's mainly in newspapers like Haaretz and on some of the television channels. Most of the mainstream media is still focused on the suffering by Israelis.
Yeah, and obviously the fate of the hostages.
We haven't even mentioned it yet, interestingly. So it kind of shows how one-sided people can be.
What? Sorry, what? Say it again.
Yeah, you haven't mentioned October 7th even once. So
I mentioned it right at the beginning. Actually.
Everybody's focused on one side that they feel more comfortable with, talking about their sacrifice. It's a very one-sided war in that people kind of tend to look at the side that they feel most sympathetic with.
So, and what's the main coverage been in the Israeli papers? What's the main focus?
Well, the coverage has been obviously from October 7. A lot of it has been about how the IDF failed on October 7. There's been a lot of investigative work, a lot of really shocking, I think, failures leading up to it on the intelligence level, leading wherever it comes when it comes to both the strategic level, the political level, the failures made in the way that Israel assessed Hamas's intentions and the way that it didn't. Most of the signs were seen, but they certainly weren't interpreted in the right way. There's been obviously a lot of coverage of the Israeli victims on October 7, of what has happened with them since, of the 100,000 Israelis who had forced to leave their homes in communities around Gaza, And at the same time, there's a similar situation. Well, it hasn't been a full-on war, but there's been a situation where about 80,000 Israelis have had to leave the northern border because Hezbollah started firing on Israeli communities there as well. So there's been a lot of coverage of that. There's a lot of coverage of, obviously, of the political aspects. We're already 4 months into this, and Netanyahu has yet to acknowledge any kind of responsibility as the man who was leading Israel for so many years, leading up to this. He's mainly tried to sort of divert attention and blame to other people, to the military, to the intelligence community, who obviously have a lot of blame here. So the Israeli, I think, media is kind of focused on these political machinations. The government has basically lost the trust of most of the Israeli public. There's the question of how long the government can last. And there's a lot of day-to-day coverage. There's just the war on the ground.
I'm interested in the split within the cabinet. Sorry, I'm interested in the splits within the cabinet, particularly when it comes to how to deal with the hostages.
Well, when you say the cabinet, there are basically 3 cabinets. There's the cabinet with all the ministers. There isn't, in the British sense, the cabinet ministers and junior ministers. Every minister is a member of the cabinet, which whenever it meets. Then there are inner cabinet. So there's a security cabinet, which currently has 14 ministers, and the main decision-making body, which is a 5-minister war cabinet, and that didn't exist before the war. This was 4 days after the war began. Benny Gantz basically went to Netanyahu and said, "Look, you want to be able to run this war without the crazies on the far right." And Netanyahu obviously agreed with him, because if he didn't agree with him, he wouldn't have taken Gantz into a war cabinet. So there's a 5-member war cabinet. The war cabinet is not, like you said, it's full of splits. So 5 members, and Netanyahu is notionally the head of the war cabinet, though according to many sources, he's not that much. His involvement there is just usually dithering and sitting on the fence. There's Netanyahu's defense minister from Likud, Yoav Gallant, who is a Likud member, but he and Netanyahu have been at loggerheads since last March, when they fell out over the judicial overhaul. There is Ron Dermer, who is Netanyahu's closest advisor, and he's a minister, and he's a member of the war cabinet. He's interestingly hasn't got any military experience, but he's the closest person to Netanyahu, which is why he's there. He's also sort of the unofficial foreign minister and plenipotentiary who gets sent on sensitive diplomatic missions. Netanyahu doesn't really trust his foreign minister. And then there's Benny Gantz, and Benny Gantz's party colleague, Gadi Eisenkot, both of them former chiefs of staff of the IDF. Both of them are, you could call, the centrist or the pragmatic wing of the war cabinet and of the emergency coalition right now. And there is a lot of disagreements there. Currently, most recently, disagreement has been or is over what kind of a hostage agreement Israel should agree to, and whether Israel can accept a long ceasefire, or even perhaps an end to the fighting in return for the release of the hostages. Gantz and Eisenkot are in favor of prioritizing the hostages. Netanyahu and Gallant less. Dermer basically goes along with whatever Netanyahu says. But it's not a forum where the number matters. What matters is keeping the forum together. It's reaching a consensus. And if at some point Gantz and Eisenkot feel that they don't have any influence, and they have had quite a lot of influence so far. They've had influence in blocking a preemptive attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. They had a lot of influence going into the previous hostage agreement 2 months ago. But if they feel that Netanyahu is blocking a hostage agreement, then they will probably have to leave the cabinet and leave the emergency coalition altogether. And that would probably be also the watershed moment when serious protests begin, and quite likely a countdown to an early election. Netanyahu obviously doesn't want that to happen, and he's not yet. So he's sort of talking he's talking to both sides on this.
Can you just remind us how his coalition is propped up at the moment and how vulnerable that might be in the circumstances?
So there are basically 2 coalitions. There's the original coalition, which was formed at the end of 22, which is Netanyahu's Likud, along with 2 far-right parties, Religious Zionism and Jewish power, and then two ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and Yahoo Torah Judaism. They have a majority of 64 seats in the 120-member Knesset. That's the original coalition. That's the coalition Netanyahu sought for so long in 5 consecutive elections between 19 and 22, until he finally managed to eke out, mainly because of the opposition being so badly divided, he somehow managed to get to 64 seats, a small but a majority nonetheless. That's the coalition, or the original coalition. Add to that 12 seats of Gantz's party, who joined on October 10, an emergency coalition. So Netanyahu doesn't want to lose Gantz's part, because it also he doesn't want to have to run the war just with the far right. He wants to have a more pragmatic wing in his coalition, and certainly with him in the war cabinet, balancing out the extremists. Also, he wants, I think, for international respectability and for also some level of public support. Even though he's lost public support, there is public support now for the government in this shape, thanks to the fact that the more pragmatic people have joined. So he's got these two wings. He needs to balance himself between the far right, and part of the emergency coalition, Gantz's pragmatic wing. And he's constantly in a balancing act there. For example, on the hostage agreement, you're hearing messages from him, and mainly from his mouthpieces, saying, no, we can't agree to stop the war. We have to carry on until total victory. And yes, we want to rescue the hostages, but not at any price, and not at the risk of jeopardizing the goal of destroying Hamas. And then you've got what's actually happening, the fact that Israeli representatives, mainly Mossad chief David Barnea, are in Cairo or in Doha. These negotiations are happening with an active Israeli side. That is only happening because Netanyahu authorizes it. So he's going both ways, and when the moment of truth arrives, if there is an agreement on the table, because right now we're still talking about drafts, when there is an agreement, he'll have to make a choice, and quite likely, whatever he decides, whether he decides to take the agreement or reject it, will result in the loss of one of those parts of his coalition, with political implications going forward.
So, I mean, I guess it's very difficult to guess, isn't it? Are you saying his days are numbered? Does he have an interest in sustaining the conflict? It's difficult to sustain the conflict if he doesn't have the support of his partners.
Well, the conflict has been going on for 76 years, so sustaining it is.
No, you know what I mean. I mean the active military operation in Gaza.
The war on the ground in Gaza has changed in shape over the last 4 months. The first 3 weeks there were only airstrikes, then began a ground maneuver which gradually intensified, and at its peak there were four or five even divisions there on the ground. Now we're down to barely 2 divisions. The fighting, the active fighting, is happening mainly around Khan Yunis, in and around Khan Yunis, the second largest city of Gaza Strip to the south. In Gaza City, there are mainly cordons cutting Gaza City off from the south, and some mobile forces, but probably no more than 2 brigades. So what we've actually seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks is a quite rapid scaling down of Israeli forces in Gaza. Now, partly that's because the IDF is expecting there to be a hostage agreement anyway. Partly this is by design. They didn't want to keep 4 or 5 entire divisions mobilized. That meant also keeping hundreds of thousands of reservists mobilized. So the war has, the war is now at a sort of transitory phase where there is war. There is this full-on war still happening around the smaller city, which is Khan Yunis. Gaza City itself, there are very few IDF troops right now inside Gaza City, certainly not in the way they were up to 3 or 4 weeks ago, sort of almost stationary in large areas. Now they're much more mobile. There's not that many civilians left in Gaza. There's assessed around maybe 200,000 of the 1.2 or 3 million that were there before. So there's maybe 20%, probably less of the original population still in Gaza. But Gaza City is in a sort of semi-destroyed, mainly emptied situation, like I said, with about a couple 100,000 people at the most still there. And there's no heavy fighting happening in Gaza City, which could lead either to another stage of the war, where Israel was planning anyway after 3 or 4 months, or the IDF was planning to move, to sort of transit to a more mobile type of smaller scale units carrying out raids in specific places, or it could lead to a ceasefire. Though for the IDF's purpose, a ceasefire, if it's not a permanent one, would work, because it would help them also to refresh the troops and to kind of prepare the next plans. In a way, I think the IDF now is more pragmatic than certainly the far right in the government, in that they would accept a month or 2 months of a truce now for the purpose of releasing hostages and also for regrouping. But whether that leads to a full ceasefire, when you say, as you said, does that mean that, how do you sustain it from Netanyahu's perspective when he's saying that he's going for total victory? Can that be sustained? It's really a matter of how it's being presented to the Israeli public. Netanyahu says we are now going with all force, we're attacking, we haven't scaled down anything. That's not true. Israel has scaled down the operations. Can he sustain that simply for political reasons? Not with Gantz and Eisenkot in the cabinet. They're too savvy when it comes to military issues. They won't stick around if that's the case.
I dropped out there, so I don't know if we managed to take any questions yet, but I'd love to start taking them now if we can. So Alan Livingston. Alan, do you want to open your microphone? Go on, Alan.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go on now. Go on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I read yesterday that Hamas has begun, and it was either in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, that Hamas has begun to appear in areas where the IDF is pulled back, especially in Gaza City, mainly in the form of policemen, civil servants, and they are starting to make back payroll. I wondered if that's true and what that means for the Israeli army if Hamas starts to reappear and take a leadership role. Also, I was wondering, the leadership has not been found in 4 months of looking for them. Do you think that they might have escaped and they're out of the country at this time?
So, first of all, yeah, it's true. It was reported first in the Israeli media before you read it in the New York Times or wherever else. It's been the case for a week or so in the places, as I said before, the IDF is no longer in most of Gaza City, and Hamas have made a show, obviously want to show that they're still standing, which is why they put out police with uniforms to kind of make a point. And Hamas has been drastically weakened there, but obviously still have people, and therefore they're going to try and make a point that they're still there. And for them, that would be a victory to show that they're still in charge of Gaza. I don't think this constitutes being in charge of Gaza, but right now, there's a vacuum in Gaza. There isn't any other force, and this is probably Israel's biggest failure, not having addressed that issue because of the political divisions within the government, not having addressed the issue of what happens on the day after. We've barely spoken about that yet, but I expect we will in a moment. So that really is something that's happening, but it seems to be more at this point of Hamas making these gestures of showing how the Israelis haven't beaten us, so we can still put police on the streets. There's not that many streets to police in Gaza right now, and Hamas is trying to put a show on of having survived. That show should be taken for what it is. As the further leadership goes, so the sort of the triumvirate of Hamas's top leadership in Gaza, which is Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Def, and Marwan Issa, they haven't yet been located. The original, or until very recently, the assessment was that they were hiding under Khan Yunis. That may still be the case. There still is a very extensive tunnel network under Khan Yunis, and the IDF hasn't been through all of it yet, so they could still be there. They could have taken tunnels or gone in under disguise further south to Rafah, where most of the refugees are, and that is the place where Israel will have a lot more difficulty operating because, as I said, most refugees, around 1.3 million, or more than half of Gaza's population, are now concentrated in that area around Rafah, which is about 20% of Gaza's population. Not only is it very crowded, it's also on the Egyptian border, which has its own set of sensitivities. So they could still be under Khan Yunis, they could be in Rafah. There have been some suggestions that they may have gone out to Egypt. If that's the case, then I don't see them coming back in again, and that's in itself is I think a quite significant thing. I don't think that's the case. I think that Sinwar and Def certainly are Gazans. They were born there. They were there when Hamas was founded in 1987. And there's been talk that maybe they'll do they could be in agreement like in 1982 when Yasser Arafat agreed to leave Beirut and go to Tunisia, even though Israel had him in their sights. They allowed him to leave as part of that deal. I think the relationship between Hamas and Gaza is not the same as the relationship between Arafat and Beirut. So I think that as far as Sinwar and Def and Issa are concerned, it's either live or die in Gaza. And if they're not on the Khan Yunis, then they're probably in Rafah now.
Well, we will come to more questions in a second. Anshel, you recently wrote about Jake Sullivan's outline of a possible post-war solution, a three-stage plan. First, the war in Gaza ends with Hamas, for all purposes, no longer capable of exerting any authority in the enclave. Then Israel leaves Gaza and a revitalized Palestinian Authority takes control. And a third and final stage, Israel and the PA relaunch the diplomatic process towards a two-state solution, while Saudi Arabia normalizes its ties with Israel and writes an 11-figure check to fund a mega rebuilding project. What do you think are the possible outcomes of a truce and international agreement? What is possible at this stage?
Well, you mentioned three stages. Actually, the Americans are now working for a four-stage plan because they've understood that this is not a period in which you can talk to the Israeli, not just the Israeli government, but many Israeli people about a two-state solution after what happened on October 7. So they realized that there has to be two stages. First of all, the hostage issue has to be resolved. So before the three stages you mentioned, there is also a hostage agreement stage, and this is what the Americans are very much invested in right now. What are the possible outcomes? The American plan sounds wonderful. I'd love for the American plan to become reality as soon as possible. Would be great. Two-state solution, normalization with the Saudis and perhaps with other Arab countries. The Saudis picking up the bill. By the way, it's very interesting that the Saudis, despite everything that's been happening, they seem very sanguine about making peace with Israel, and all the 5 countries which already have made or have established diplomatic relations with Israel, none of them have downgraded those relations. So there's an interesting kind of take in the Arab world where on the one hand condemning Israel for the damage and the blood and the death in Gaza, at the same time not changing any of their diplomatic aspirations. And this is where I think this is the problem with the Blinken plan, kind of to bridge between this future for the Middle East that Mohammed bin Salman sees, in which Israel and the Arab and the Sunni Arab states have normalized their ties, and somehow the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been solved by the two-state solution. To get to that place from where we are right now seems to me still incredibly difficult. And let's not forget, the Oslo process began over 30 years ago, and it didn't work, and it hasn't worked since. So the idea that now it'll work because we've had this terrible event of the last 4 months, and this somehow shock both the Israelis and the Palestinians into accepting the two-state solution, If only.
But there isn't really a viable Palestinian state as it stands anyway. I mean, many Palestinians would say there's no such thing as a two-state solution anymore. The reality is a one-state solution, which is what you have now.
Well, the viable Palestinian state is whatever the Palestinians are willing to accept, and right now they're not willing to accept, and Israel's not willing to give. So there is no viable. The two-state solution, I think, still is the only viable solution. But because these two nations are not going to live together, they're perhaps in a few generations they'll be able to do so, but it's not something that's going to happen in our lifetime. So the two-state solution is the only viable solution. There are the parameters are still there. The realities on the ground are not actually. You would have to move about 150,000 settlers. That's doable. But you still have to have two governments or two leaderships or two nations coming together in agreement over this, and we're simply nowhere near them being able to do so. Now, it's possible, after the Yom Kippur War, which was had also casualties in the tens of thousands, mainly soldiers, but still a terrible death toll on both sides. 6 years later, so that was in Jerusalem, speaking in the Knesset and making peace with Israel. So that it was possible then. Not that I want to compare, but 8 years after the Holocaust, Israel was already signing diplomatic agreements with West Germany. Who would have thought in 1945 that 8 years later there would be a sovereign Jewish state and Germany would be back on its feet, and they would be signing agreements. So, terrible enmities and deadly enmities can be overcome and have been overcome. The American plan is very, very hopeful. And we haven't even begun to speak about the divisions within the Palestinian side. I mean, can Hamas and Fatah somehow agree to something? Can Fatah, is there a Fatah leadership that can engage with Israel on a two-state solution? There are so many moving parts, and there's so many spoilers. I mean, Hamas does everything Iran has been doing to try and avert such. Iran doesn't want a two-state solution. And within Israel, you've got to convince the Israeli public. A majority of the Israeli public supported a two-state solution until not recently, and until not that long ago. Now it's going to be a much harder sell after what happened on October 7th. So the American plan is a great plan on paper. I'd love to see it become a reality, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I'd love to take more questions about what happens next, everyone. So if you've got more questions along those lines, please do put them in the Q&A box. There are divisions on the right within the government about the release of hostages and particularly about the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the hostages. Can you just outline what that opposition is?
Well, whatever the deal is going to be, it's going to be a lopsided deal. It was 3 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for every Israeli one. So Israel has always agreed to release more prisoners. And in this case, also, most of the Palestinian prisoners are being held and have been convicted of terror charges. We're talking about Israelis who were most of I think about, still at this point, 60 or 70% of the hostages are civilians who were snatched from their homes. So Israel has always agreed to lopsided deals and to release more than the Palestinians have released. In this case, we're talking about something that could reach thousands of Palestinian prisoners. Some of them who have been convicted of murder and other terror-related crimes. So that's always going to be a sensitive thing for Israelis. At the same time, I think that will be something, and we're already seeing the polls that a majority of Israelis would agree to that. But the right wing who are in government are less supportive of such a. We're talking about the right and the far right. So certainly the far right are less supportive of that. And as I said before, it's not just the question of what happens with, how many prisoners will be released. It's a question of what this means for the major operations in Gaza going on. Does it mean that Israel ends and basically Hamas can just come back and say we won? Or is it just a pause of a couple of months and then the war in some shape or form continues? And that's, I think, the main sticking point is what kind of a ceasefire this is going to be. Does it include a total withdrawal? Does it include some kind of Israeli commitment not to restart military operations once this period of truce and hostage and prisoner releases ends. And that's I think where the main opposition on the right to this deal is.
There are religious sort of right-wingers who want to re-establish kibbutzes in Gaza, but there's also a military plan to have a border area, a bit like southern Lebanon.
No. There's no plan to establish kibbutzes and settlements.
There are clearly religious movements that would like to re-establish kibbutzes in Gaza. That's what I say.
No, settlements are not kibbutzes. They're two different things. There's two very different types of communities.
Say settlements.
You said kibbutzes. The kibbutzes are outside Gaza in Israel's sovereign, and they were destroyed by Hamas. The settlements inside Gaza.
Okay, well, it established an Israeli population within Gaza. Whichever description. There's that, which is obviously a religious goal, but the IDF wants to establish what currently is trying to establish a protective or a safe zone within Gaza.
Well, the buffer zone, what they're calling, is basically, it already exists. Most of the area, so the perimeter, about 1,000 meters from the Israeli border, sort of inwards, has been. Most of the buildings there have already been destroyed at different stages of the war, and this is what the IDF is basically because the IDF hasn't really got any kind of directive from the Israeli government. They've been sort of clearing this area. Now, the real question is what happens in that area once there is some kind of a ceasefire. Does it become an area which the IDF is physically inside? Will they? There is no current plan yet, whether this is an area which they'll have static forces in or outposts, whether there'll be mobile patrols in it, or whether it'll simply be an area which becomes a no-go area. All these are possible scenarios, but this is something that mainly, and we've been very touched upon this, because the Israeli government is so dysfunctional on a political level, because of the disparity in views there isn't any clear directive to the IDF what they need to do, how they need to prepare for the day after. I mean, the IDF is getting its orders from the war cabinet on when to act, what to do on the ground, on a tactical level. The question of whether to have a buffer zone afterwards, and whether it even be something that is military viable, is it something that that the Americans will object to? Will it be, or will it even be a bargaining chip in future negotiations? And so, for now, Israel can't trust Hamas, and Israel has to protect itself, and therefore there'll be a buffer zone. But if certain things happen in the future, Israel will say, okay, we're not going to maintain this buffer zone anymore. This is all up in the air, and the IDF is basically just making the tactical preparations it can, because it doesn't have any directive from the government what to do beyond that.
Okay, question from Vaughan Grills. Vaughan, go ahead, please. Vaughan, you need to open your microphone.
Sorry. Yes, I'm in the US at the moment, and I usually read the New York Times, but today, as you know, there's a big article about the Israeli troops, IDF, using mocking and all sorts of things, and videos of them mocking Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and also children being shot at going to school with IDF troops shooting tear gas at them, and so on and so forth. I mean, looking at the below-the-line comments and speaking to Americans here, I get the impression that Israel risks losing a lot of American support among the general public. And it worries me because it will give fuel to the international criminal court investigation that's taking place now. What's the feeling in the Israeli government about that? Is there any sort of feeling about the dangers there that this could bring for them?
Well, once again, the problem is talking about the Israeli government as a collective. There are parts of the Israeli government which I think really want to provoke a crisis in Israel-US relations, partly because they believe that there are other parts of the US which are so pro-Israel, and they're the ones who are going to prevail, whether it's Trump or something even worse than Trump down the road. And there is perhaps even some truth to the fact that, one of the reasons why everyone's saying this is causing Joe Biden a lot of damage in parts of his constituency, in parts of the Democratic Party. People are not asking the other question: Is Joe Biden worried that he's not as supportive of Israel as he is? He'll there'll be damage on the other side of the Democrats, and certainly with independent voters, that he needs to win the election in November. And also, Biden himself, I think, is instinctively very pro-Israel. He said you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, and so on. So, like I said, they're part of the Israeli government which would happily provoke a big showdown with the Democrats, because they want a more an even more pro, as they see it, being pro-Israel, certainly pro-settler administration in Washington, and they bridle at whatever limits there are. The US still does put on Israel, and there are certainly parts of the government which are very concerned about this happening. And this kind of goes back to what I've been saying before about how there are two very, very disparate wings of this government. Certainly, they're not in any, not synchronized in any way, and they're basically part of two different Israel. There's the original Israeli government, which was which was established at the end of 22, and then there's the war cabinet government, which is where Netanyahu sits with the other side, with the more pragmatic side, and that side certainly is very concerned about the damage to, or the potential damage at least, to Israel-US relations.
I don't know if you've got Steve Kenny still with us. I can't see his name in front of us, but he did ask a question which was slightly offbeat, but I quite like it. He says, I'm always interested in people who we're listening to and how they figure on all these activities. What will you be doing in the next 48 hours to fulfill your work and responsibilities?
Oh, wow. I've got a couple of pieces to write. One is about Cyprus, which is going to be in The Economist. I've got a piece to write about in Haaretz, which sort of is going to be dealing also with some of the religious aspects. And I'm one of the people who says that this is very much a war of is very much a religious war. So this is kind of a column that I write different variations of trying to explain why this is why I'm pretty certain it's a religious war more than anything else. And there's the Blinken visits, which I have to monitor. I'm not going to actually go to anything with Blinken, because anybody who's covered these kind of things knows that journalists are held in a tiny bubble and given handouts. There's no need to actually be there. You can sit wherever you are, and you'll get whatever the journalists who are actually there at the meeting, sort of looking at the meeting up close, will get. So I'm not, usual things: meeting with sources, talking to people, reporting, etc. It's very much a day-by-day existence right now, reporting on this war, because there's so many days. It's
exhausting, though, as well, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's exhausting, though, as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's. I've taken, I think, a total of 6 days off in the last 120 days, but that's. Yeah, it's a war. It really is a war. I mean, Israel is a mobilized society, and even though there's sort of some scaling down, and one of the things, we talk about whether it's Hamas, how Hamas has been doing. The fact in the last 2 months there's only been one rocket launch into Israel. I mean, deep into Israel, beyond the communities near Gaza's border, means that the war is beginning to be less felt in central Israel. So you don't necessarily feel it every single moment, but it's there in the headlines the whole time. And everybody knows people who have been mobilized, who are still there. People have just come out. So yeah, it's exhausting as a journalist, but people say how exhausting it must be for you to cover this war. And I say, yes, but if I was a small business, if I wasn't a journalist, and if I was a small business owner, I'd be in a much, at least as journalists, I have a lot of work to do. If I had to shut down my company, as many have had because of what's been happening, I'd be in a much worse situation. Maybe I'd I'd have less work, but I wouldn't know how I'm going to put food on the table the next day.
Maybe it's too big a question, but I'm interested in your description of this as a religious war. My take is that both Palestinian and Israeli societies are martial, M-A-R-T-I-A-L, in that they're both heavily militarized. If you're living in a Palestinian refugee camp, the people you admire are the guys with the guns, and you don't have much prospect of becoming an anaesthetist, or your options are pretty limited. And likewise in Israel, I find Israeli the degree to which you have military leaders within government, the fact that 70% of the country do military service, I think that shapes society's outlooks. So on both sides, I view them as being caught in a sort of militarized outlooks, if you like. But your view is it's more religious.
First of all, living in a country which has a standing army, it's not, it's less, or conscription is something which people in the West are not that acquainted with anymore. But go back a generation or two, and that was a situation, not just during the World War. So, the fact that today, Britain, I'm seeing the whole time headlines of Britain's army being much too small, and what's going to happen, and what they're going to do with recruitment. The fact that in the West there's a generation of people who have very little military experience is a new thing. So Israel is another part of the world where I think conscription is less of a rare situation. So I don't think the fact that so many Israelis and so many Palestinians have experience and know how to fight and know is a reason for the wars. I think one of the main motives for the wars ultimately are two nations fighting over a piece of land which both see exclusively as their own. And the main motive of seeing that is a religious motive. Jews see this as their land because they believe in Jewish history, which is ultimately biblical history. And on the far right, more, those who are all actually going and living in settlements in the West, deep in the West Bank, are also much more motivated by religious motives. And therefore, one of the things which is exacerbating and making it much more difficult to reach a two-state solution are those who are acting out of religious motives. And on the Palestinian side as well, the Hamas attackers who came over on October 7th didn't shout, "Let's kill the Zionists," and didn't shout, "Let's decolonize and end the colonialism," or any of those fashionable words of Western academics.
Well, Hamas is clearly a religious movement. Yeah,
they shouted, "Let's kill the Jews." And currently Hamas is, like you said, is popular. And so it's all the things together. The occupation is a part, and the conflict which has been going over a century. But if, it's as difficult as it is for Western people to I think, to conceive of a religious war in our day and age. You think the religious war thing goes back to the Crusades, doesn't exist in anybody's living memory. No, in this part of the world, certainly Israel-Palestine conflict, religion is a huge, huge part. It's a motivator for both sides. And I think that people need to accept and understand the role of religion on both sides. And this is not to say that any religion is necessarily a bad religion, but religions are also used as motives for war, for murder, for bloodshed. And that's been the case throughout history. And it's very much the case, I think, in this war.
Anshel, it's always interesting talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. We learned a huge amount. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been really good.